So in the previous lesson, we installed the styled components NPM library, which allows us to utilize CSS in JS. So I want to show you how that works in this lesson. What we're going to do is transfer all of these CSS styles from our app.module.css file into our app.js file. Remember, the idea behind CSS in JS is that we can write all of our CSS directly within our JavaScript file. So we no longer have this file separation. We simply define the styles alongside the JavaScript or the components, or in other words, the JSX that is using those styles. So I have the two files open side by side so we can see this in action. So the first thing I'm going to do is I no longer need this styles object because we are no longer going to be importing from app.module.css. We're going to be using that file styles, but we're not going to actually use the file import itself. So once I delete that, you can see all of these old references to that styles object are breaking. So we'll need to replace all of these rendered JSX elements with the equivalent. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import the default export of the styled components library, which is an object, and I'm going to call that object styled, and that is going to come from styled-components. That is what we installed in the previous lesson. So the way that styled works, that object has a whole bunch of methods available on it, and all of those methods correspond with valid HTML elements. So for example, there is a div method. There is a p method for paragraph. There is a header element. So any type of HTML element, there is a corresponding method on that styled object. And the way it works is whenever we invoke that method, we're going to get back a valid React component. Okay, so for example, here in our current app component, we are returning a top-level div. So on the styled object, we're going to have a div method. And when we invoke that, we're going to get back an HTML, or more specifically, React component representing a div. So we can invoke this method, but the traditional syntax you're going to see is going to look like this. We're actually going to use template strings. And as a reminder, in JavaScript, it's this symbol right here. It's the one we use for template strings in JavaScript. For example, when we interpolate or inject a value into a string, we use these tick marks. That's what we're going to use here. And this is a special feature in JavaScript called tagged template literals. This is a regular JavaScript feature. It's not specific to React. But what's actually happening here is we are invoking the div method on that styled object, and we are passing in the string right here as the first argument. It's sort of like a shorthand syntax. It's a little bit of an abbreviated shortcut that we can use to perform that logic. And the reason that we use these template strings is because they allow us to break up code across multiple lines. So this, for example, is still going to be viewed as a string right here, whatever we put in here, and that string is going to become the first argument to the div method. So this is an invocation. It's just a little bit of a different syntax. It's a little bit weird when you first see it, but you'll discover it's actually pretty elegant. So the way that this library is meant to work is we're going to reference the library, then the HTML element that we want to create a component for, and then to this tagged template literal, to this template string, in other words, we can pass any valid CSS style declarations, and those will automatically be applied to the div. So if we are trying to model this div right here, it has the class of app. App is defined right here, and you can see it has a single CSS declaration, which is text-align set to center. So I'm going to cut and paste this exact CSS line right here, like so. In fact, I'm going to indent it a little bit just so we can separate it. And then I'm going to bring this string up and just simply invoke it just like a regular JavaScript object method. So I can totally place a semicolon at the end. Remember, this is a method invocation under the hood. It just looks a little bit weird because it's probably a different syntax from what you're used to. So again, what we're getting back here is a React component that represents an HTML div or a JSX div with the style of text-align center. So what I'm going to do is assign this to a const. In this case, I'm going to call it app container. The name is totally up to us, like so. So you can almost think of this as defining a React component in line that just happens to be a div. So now what we can do is use this app container div to replace the former div we have right here. So here is our opening div, here is our closing div. I'm going to replace that with app container. And so right here, I'm going to replace this div with app container. Remember, what the styled div method is giving us is a React component, so we render it the exact same way as a regular React component. And we do not need to apply an additional class name attribute because those styles are already pre-applied to the div when it is declared right here. Okay, so let's show you another example. The next thing we have is a header element. So what I'm going to do is once again use the styled components library to create a pre-styled header component. So right here, I'm going to call this just app header. The name is up to me. And then I'm going to reference my styled object. As I mentioned, all of the methods here are valid HTML elements. So I'm going to look for header. And then I'm going to provide that template string syntax. So those two little tick marks. And typically you're going to break them up across different lines. And in between is where you're going to put those CSS styles. So in this case, our header has the styles from the app header class. That's right here. So what I'm going to do is simply cut and paste these exact CSS declarations in line right here. And right now, of course, we are copying and pasting, but in the real world, if you were building this from scratch, you would simply write your CSS directly in line here in your JS file. So it's still the same CSS declaration syntax that we're used to, and we can use even regular CSS like the dashes, right? Because that's totally fine. They are coming in as a string, right? And within a string, those hyphens are valid. They're just not valid as, for example, a constant names in JavaScript, but they're totally valid as values within a string, right? Because they're just regular characters. So now we have from this method a new React component that represents a header with these styles. So once again, scrolling down where we have this header right here, I'm going to replace this with app header. And down below where we previously had our header, I'm going to replace this with app header. So one of the nice things about this design is we no longer have class name referenced right here because we have all the styles already built into this component because we define it right here. Right? And if you ever want to reuse these components, it's as simple as saving them to a separate component file and simply exporting this as your file component. You don't even need to use an additional function syntax or anything like that because this is a valid React component that's being generated for you by the styled components library. All right, so let's continue through and apply the exact same logic. So right here we have this image, right? And we are applying the app logo styles to it. So up here, I'm going to define a const called logo. That will be the name of my component. And on the styled object, I'm going to have access to image, right? Same deal. I'm going to apply the tagged template literal syntax, break this up. And now I want to copy all the styles for my logo. So app logo right here. Here is that CSS class in my CSS module. I'm going to cut this and paste it here like so. But notice we're also using app logo right here. We actually have a media query that is targeting a specific case. So what I can do is copy this entire collection of code and once again, simply paste it within the template string. So anything in here can be totally valid CSS. We can do things like responsiveness. We can target things like hover states. Anything that we can do in a regular CSS file, we can do in here as long as it is within that template string that you provide after the invocation of that specific method from the styled object. So this is referencing the name of an animation called app logo spin, which is referenced right here. It's a keyframe. So I'm just going to cut and paste this as well, put it right into here. All right, and that is our logo. So once again, scrolling down, where we have image, we no longer need class name. That is gone. And I'm going to keep my other two attributes, source and alt, because those still need to exist. That is the location of the image as well as the alt text. But instead of image right here, I'm simply going to render logo like so. And it is self-closing, so we do not need to have any kind of closing tag. This should work just fine. So notice this time that the attributes that apply to the regular HTML element are simply going to flow down. So even though we're passing these into the component, which is a syntax that we might not have seen before, this is totally valid. You can think of these attributes as floating down to whatever logo is, which is an image HTML element at the end of the day. Technically a JSX element, which you get that it's basically the same thing, right? So now we've replaced the former div, the former header, the former image. The only thing that's left here is this anchor tag, right? So we're going to do the exact same logic. So right here, I'm going to say const link. That's the name I'll give to my component. it's going to be something from the styled components library. Once again, I'm going to find the right method, which is simply the element that I'm looking for. In this case, it's an anchor tag. So in A, I'm going to provide that tick syntax. And right here, I'm going to copy the remaining style from app link. That is our CSS class. Paste it in here. There we go. And so now, once again, we no longer need class name. We're going to keep all the other attributes, but rather than the anchor tag being rendered, we're going to render a link. And similarly, we have to remember to provide the closing component tag as well. So as a reminder, just like in HTML, we can have opening and closing tags as we have with app container, app header, etc. And we can also have self-closing tags like logo right here. It should work just fine. Okay, so with that, we have completely emptied out our app.module.css file. So I'm going to close it. It's no longer being imported at the very top, so we can go ahead and actually remove it entirely. So right here, I'm going to right-click and delete app.module.css. And the next thing I want to do is go back to our browser just to verify that everything is working as expected. I'm just going to refresh this page, and you can see everything is still working as expected. So it does appear like one feature is broken, and that is the rotation of the actual React icon. The reason for that was a quick mistake, was right here. We are still referencing our former app logo class, which no longer needs to exist. This is the actual style that we want to apply to the image tag right here. So if we simply remove that app logo class, now we're going to apply that CSS animation property to our image, which is exactly what we want. If I go back to the browser now, you can see we're back to our original state. Okay, so slight mistake on my part, but as you can see, we have replicated all of our original CSS styles from our module file directly within our regular app component file, which is a plain JavaScript file. So that is an introduction to CSS in JS using styled components, and I will see you in the next lesson.